Cecil Stedman is not a good person. The show doesn't hide that. So here's the question. What if that man raised Mark Grayson? We need a scenario that holds up, because this question only gets interesting if the answer doesn't collapse into Mark turns evil. Nolan is exposed or killed before Mark is old enough to remember him. Maybe the Viltrumite Empire checks on his progress ahead of schedule and things escalate beyond what Nolan can quietly manage. Maybe his cover gets blown some other way and he runs. Either path works. What matters is that Mark is 3 or 4 years old, young enough that he won't carry the personal wounds of betrayal later, but old enough that the absence has some impact on him. Cecil has had the Grayson family on his radar since before Mark was born. In canon, we know the GDA was watching Nolan, had files on him, and was running a full monitoring operation around his presence on Earth. Cecil knew what Nolan was. Like, in a world where Nolan disappears or dies early, Cecil moves fast because he has to. His whole plan around Nolan assumed continued presence and cooperation. Without that, something has to change. And the most obvious next move involves the kid currently eating cereal in a suburb somewhere. Debbie is still around, at least at first. Here's where it gets complicated, because Cecil doesn't have to be cruel to get what he wants from her. He just has to be useful. He shows up with resources, with a version of the truth more complete than anything she'd find elsewhere, and with an argument she can't dismiss. Your son is going to develop abilities, significant ones, the kind that draw attention from people you are not equipped to handle. I can protect him. I can prepare him. And I can tell you things about his father that you deserve to know. Debbie is smart. The show makes this clear. She pieces together the truth about Nolan from scraps and gut instinct before most people would have even thought to start looking. She'd know on some level that she's being handled, but knowing doesn't give her better options, so she takes the deal, tells herself she'll watch carefully and pull Mark out if she needs to, and Cecil tells himself the same thing about her, that she's useful until she isn't, and he'll deal with it when that moment comes. Cecil runs the structure, Debbie provides the warmth. Those two things are already pulling against each other before Mark's powers ever show up. Cecil wouldn't be cruel to a child, and it'd be a mistake to picture him that way. He's smart, often interesting to be around, and he does care about the people in his orbit who matter to his plans. He'd be precise with Mark. Present when something counted, gone when it didn't. Rewarding results in ways that felt like pride. Building a tight feedback loop in Mark from an age when Mark had no way to see it for what it was. Here's the first big split from anything in canon. Mark never has a real father. This sounds obvious, but it's the base of everything that follows. In the show and comics, Nolan is present for a long stretch of Mark's life. He's not just an authority figure. He coaches Mark, jokes with him, builds something with real weight and history behind it. The betrayal hits as hard as it does because something real was there first. Cecil can't recreate that. He wouldn't try because he doesn't think in those terms. What Cecil gives Mark instead is information and access. From an early age, Mark would know more about how the world really works than any kid his age has any business knowing. Not in a vague, I've seen dark stuff way, in the practical sense. He'd understand what the GDA does. He'd have sat through briefings, he'd have read incident reports classified at the top level for everyone outside the agency. The Reaniman Project, whatever sanitized version Cecil decided he could see, he'd know that exists. He'd know about the global monitoring of superhuman activity. He'd have a working mental map of threat categories and how the GDA responds to them by the time other kids his age were arguing about video games. Cecil would call all of this respect. He doesn't talk down to Mark. He gives him real information because he needs Mark to act on real information one day. And treating a future asset like a child produces a person who thinks like one. This works on Mark for years because it's partly true, and kids respond hard to being treated like they can handle things. Mark would feel growing up like Cecil truly believes in him. That feeling would be real and also completely beside the point of what's being built. What's missing is joy, not happiness. Cecil isn't running a misery operation, and Mark wouldn't be unhappy in any obvious sense. But there's a kind of joy that comes from doing something with no purpose attached to it, from being loved without conditions, from having time that nobody is pointing you towards something you must do. Debbie provides a lot of that in canon. Summers that are just summers. Dinner that's just dinner. Love with no return requirement. Under Cecil, everything has a direction. Even the activities Cecil allows for Mark would be serving some growth goal he already mapped out. That shapes the brain in a particular way. Mark would grow up reading meaning into everything and finding rest in nothing, and he'd have no idea that wasn't just how people were. Debbie doesn't get pushed out dramatically. She just slowly becomes less relevant in a way neither of them would name out loud. Cecil wouldn't need to do anything drastic. He'd just be more present and more useful in the areas that counted. When Mark had questions about his abilities, Cecil had answers. When Mark wanted to understand why the world worked the way it did, Cecil had a ready system for it. Debbie could offer love, normalcy, and the idea that the world was bigger than Cecil's version of it, but from inside Cecil's version, that just looked like someone who didn't have access to the real information. Mark wouldn't be unkind about it, he'd just slowly stop bringing her the real questions because she couldn't answer them the way Cecil could. Not through force, through relevance. There's also the question of how Mark relates to his Viltrumite side during this period. In canon, he grows up not knowing, and the revelation shatters his whole sense of who he is. Under Cecil, Mark knows, in some controlled version from whatever age Cecil judged appropriate, that he's half Viltrumite. Not the full picture, because Cecil never gives anyone the full picture, but the broad strokes. Your biology is this, the Empire is this is classified, here is why it matters. Right, Mark takes that in at an age when it's just information rather than a crisis. By the time it becomes relevant in the field, he's had years to sit with it. Whether that's really better than not knowing it all is harder than it looks. What you end up with by the time Mark hits his mid-teens is a kid who is highly capable and surprisingly hard to read. He'd test well on everything. He'd be good at school, not because he was forced to be, but because absorbing information and applying it is the mode he was raised on. He wouldn't be socially broken. Cecil would have made sure of that, because a hero who can't function around people is a liability. But there'd be something underneath all that competence that never quite got built. A sense of what he wants for himself, separate from what the situation requires, a comfort with doing nothing useful, an experience of caring about something with zero strategic value. These are the things that make a person feel like a person to themselves, and Mark under Cecil would be running on empty and all of them without knowing the tank was ever supposed to be full. In the show, Mark's powers coming in feels like release. The grin when he figures out he can fly, the disbelief when he sends something flying across a room, it's his. Nobody planned it, nobody briefed him on it. It just happens, and it belongs to him entirely. Under Cecil, the moment his abilities show up, they stop belonging to him before he's even done processing the fact that they're there. Cecil would know first. That's what the monitoring exists to catch. He might know before Mark fully does, depending on how deep that surveillance goes. The first real conversation Mark has about his powers wouldn't be with a friend or a parent in a moment of excitement. It would be with Cecil in a room that functions like a conference room, whether or not it looks like one, being told what this means practically and what comes next. The training would be good. Cecil has access to things no one else can match. He can bring in people who understand Viltrumite biology in ways that even Nolan's training, done entirely inside military culture, might not cover on Earth. The strength work, flight mechanics, durability testing, all of it would be systematic and more efficient than anything Canon Mark stumbles through on his own. He'd get capable faster, with fewer dangerous gaps in his understanding of what his body can do, but every hour of that training would be pointed at preparation, not self-discovery. In canon, even the rough training Mark does early on has an exploratory quality. What can I do? What does this feel like? Who am I in this body? Under Cecil, those questions get replaced before they're ever asked. What do I need to do? What are the limits? How do I do this more reliably? The body is a tool being tuned, not a person being figured out. This changes how Mark fights, especially at the highest levels. Canon Mark is hard to counter because he improvises. He finds angles that pure training wouldn't surface. That comes from the messy, self-directed process his early days run on. Cecil's Mark would be more disciplined and more by the book. and in turn more predictable. Against normal threats, that's fine. Against Viltrumites, against Thrag specifically, being predictable is a serious problem because combat at that level is about breaking whatever the other person was trained to do. The sharpest loss in this period is something that seems small. Mark never gets to be invincible before Cecil knows about it. In canon, there's a window, brief but real, where the identity is privately his, still forming without anyone watching. He makes choices about who he wants to be, with no one else in the room. Under Cecil, that window is zero. The identity forms under observation from the first moment. It's never his alone before it belongs to the GDA. Going from never having a private self to immediately having a public one leaves something missing that's hard to put words to later. Now for the part that matters most, Cecil's worldview is about as close to pure math as a human being gets. Not the philosophy class version where you debate trolley problems in the abstract, but the practiced version where you've made hundreds of those calls already and stopped losing sleep over them somewhere around call number 50. He thinks in populations, in ripple effects. A single life carries weight based on how much its survival or loss changes the wider picture. This isn't a front or a story he tells himself. It's truly how he processes the world, and he'd pass that on to Mark the same way any parent passes on their view of things. Slowly, through repetition, without ever announcing that it's happening. Raised inside that way of thinking from childhood, Mark wouldn't experience it as a philosophy. He'd experience it as common sense. The same way a kid raised inside any particular belief system doesn't think of it as a belief system, like it's just how things are. Cecil's cost-benefit logic would feel as natural to Mark as gravity. He'd apply it without noticing he was applying anything. What this does to his heroism is worth being exact about. The most obvious effect is that he doesn't freeze the way canon Mark freezes. In the show, Mark's paralysis at certain moments is one of his defining traits. On the ground during the fight with Nolan because he doesn't know how to hit someone he loves, rattled after the machine head battle because the scale of the casualties forces a full reset on everything he thought he understood. The constant back and forth between what he wants and what the situation demands. That paralysis isn't a weakness, it's a conscience running in real time with no preloaded answer to fall back on. Cecil's Mark has the answers loaded in advance, the decision runs automatically, he moves faster, hesitates less, and in any given crisis he's probably more effective by the numbers. The math Cecil wants him to run, he runs. He gets through situations that stop canon Mark cold. Here's where it goes wrong. The math only works if you trust the inputs. Cecil decides what counts as an acceptable cost. Cecil picks which factors matter. Cecil sets the threat level, draws the line between asset and expendable, determines what response is proportionate. Mark, raised by Cecil, trusts those inputs the way you trust a foundation. You don't go back and check it every morning, you just build on it and assume it's sound. A foundation you never question can fail quietly for a long time before anyone notices. This isn't a theoretical concern. In canon, the moments where Cecil is clearly wrong, the Reaniman project, the deal with DA Sinclair, keeping certain threats classified in ways that get people killed who didn't have to die, all of these reveal that his inputs are shaped by his own blind spots. His risk assessments come from a particular way of seeing the world that isn't always the right one. Canon Mark catches these failures not because he has a better system, but because he has the instinct to recognize when something is wrong, and push back regardless. He doesn't have the language for a full counter-argument, he just refuses to let bad math slide. Cecil's Mark doesn't have that reflex in the same form. The raw feeling that something is off would still be there. You can't fully remove a person's moral center, but he'd have been trained since childhood to treat that feeling as a bias to correct, not a signal worth following. Emotional instincts are noise, not systematic, so at the moments where he should push back, he'd run the numbers again instead. He'd find a version of the math that makes the wrong call look like the only reasonable one. What's strange is that this doesn't look like a problem from the outside. Cecil's Mark would probably be praised for being steady and decisive where other heroes are all over the place. He'd get things done without the drama. He wouldn't generate the kind of controversy that follows Canon Mark everywhere, all that visible doubt, the public uncertainty, the messiness that makes Mark feel like an actual human being. Cecil's Mark would project control, and most people respond well to that. The counter-argument deserves a real answer. Can Cecil override Mark's fundamental decency? The comics lean hard toward the idea that Mark's moral center pushes through regardless of what's pressing on him. That's probably the intended read, but there's a real difference between a character trait existing and a character trait being reachable. Cecil couldn't cut out what's at Mark's core. What he could do is bury it under enough doctrine, enough evidence that the system produces results, that Mark never learns to act from that place. The goodness would still be there the way a signal is present in a loud room. It would just keep losing the fight for volume. And here's the thing. Cecil would never see coming because it requires a degree of self-awareness he truly lacks. The better he trains Mark to question whether someone's logic holds up and their authority is earned, the more certain it becomes that Mark eventually turns that same test on Cecil. You can't teach someone to challenge power and then expect them to stop at your door. Cecil would build this skill in Mark deliberately because someone who can only execute and never think is a liability in the field. But critical thinking doesn't come with a list of approved targets. It follows the evidence wherever that leads. The questions Cecil builds into Mark would eventually point home. There's a related problem that Cecil would also miss, and it's worth taking seriously. The more effectively he removes doubt from Mark's decision-making, the less Mark will be able to tell the difference between a good decision and a fast one. Canon Mark makes plenty of fast decisions that are wrong, and he knows it, and that awareness is what drives him to be better over time. Cecil's Mark would make fast decisions that feel right because they followed the procedure, and he'd have no reliable way to catch the ones that were actually mistakes. Confidence and accuracy can look identical from the inside. Without the kind of feedback that comes from people who care about you enough to tell you when you're wrong, without William calling him out, without Debbie pushing back, without Eve refusing to let bad calls slide, Cecil's Mark would have no real correction loop. He'd get better at executing a flawed system rather than questioning whether the system was right. It's also worth thinking about what this version of Mark looks like in the moments that define Canon Mark most sharply. The fight with Nolan, for instance. In canon, that battle is devastating, partly because Mark is fighting with no system at all. He's just a kid who loves his dad, and his dad is trying to kill him, and he has no idea what to do with that. There's no procedure. Under Cecil, there would be one. If Nolan showed up later as a threat, Cecil's Mark would engage with a level of tactical clarity that Canon Mark couldn't reach. He'd probably win. He might also win in ways that would stay with him, because handling someone you should feel complicated about, with none of those complications surfacing until after, is its own kind of damage. He'd go home with something he didn't have words for. Cecil would tell him it was handled right. The math checked out, and Mark would believe him because he always had. The show is clear about what Mark's relationships do for him. William is the uncomplicated one, just a friend, no strings, no agenda, nothing required from Mark except showing up. Amber is a reality check, someone so far outside the hero world that her reaction to things tells Mark whether he's still connected to how regular people live. Eve eventually becomes the person who understands what Mark is carrying because she carries a version of it herself. These aren't just support, they're the parts of Mark's life that exist completely outside Cecil's reach, and that's exactly why they matter. Cecil would understand the value of relationships in theory, while consistently failing to allow the kind that count. He wouldn't cut Mark off. Isolation creates instability, and he needs Mark stable. He'd let friendships happen, maybe even nudge some of them along, but the people Mark ended up close to would tend to be people already connected to the GDA world. Kids of operatives, people whose families had already been looked into. There'd be a shape to Mark's social life that Cecil put there, and Mark would never notice because it would feel like it just developed naturally. The William situation almost certainly doesn't exist in this version. William is just a guy from school. He's not useful, not a strategic connection, brings nothing to the mission. Cecil wouldn't go out of his way to block him. That's not how Cecil works. But the conditions he creates don't naturally produce that kind of friendship. Mark would have people he calls friends. He wouldn't have someone who just likes him with nothing else in the mix. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it does. You can't train it into someone. You can only give them the space to find it themselves, and that's the one thing Cecil would never allow. The version of Mark that Cecil builds is better at almost everything and missing the one thing that makes any of it worth watching. He wins more fights. He saves more people, never really becomes anyone. That's the trade-off, and it's a bad one. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.